Okay. We're back for the weekly Healing Members recording, and it's really good to see you, Christian. Glad you could make it.
Hi, Dr. Luz. How are you?
I'm good.
Good.
You can call me Mausi, whatever you feel comfortable with. Um, so today we're going to talk about recognizing the stress that we carry from day to day. And we're actually going to go through a standardized scale to measure that stress. It's called the Perceived Stress Scale. Plenty of research has been done about it. Um, uh, the results of this scale have been broken down according to race. They've been correlated with uh, people's ability to change certain health habits like smoking cigarettes. And so it's a really interesting way for us to see objectively how much stress do we feel on average over the course of a month. And before we get into that, I'm going to talk about why that's relevant, right? Because all month we're talking about building wellness, resilience, and the idea behind resilience is that you are bouncing back from some sort of adversity. So this first week, we're spending time understanding what that adversity might be, what health barriers Black folks are particularly sensitive to, so that we know what brand of resilience is going to be really important for keeping us alive, keeping us well in the long term. So one of the first messages we sent this week um, began to connect the dots between racism, both structural racism and interpersonal racism, and this chronic inflammation, which we know increases the risk of these otherwise preventable but deadly chronic diseases. So with increased chronic inflammation, people are at greater risk of developing type 2 diabetes, gaining weight, so they're at greater risk of developing obesity, greater risk of having heart attacks, stroke. There are even all these other diseases like neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, autoimmune conditions like multiple sclerosis that we see increased prevalence of in folks who have higher levels of chronic inflammation. So there's this theory of inflammation in functional medicine that suggests actually that inflammation is at the root of very many different kinds of diseases, especially these that we consider preventable lifestyle related chronic conditions. So it ends up being really important, right? If racism, which is something that affects uh, all Black folks in the United States, if racism ends up being a massive risk factor for developing chronic inflammation, and we know that chronic inflammation leads to these very diseases that disable us and kill us at higher numbers than our white counterparts, then it becomes really important to figure out how exactly um, rather, how is that connection made? What is the anatomy of the connection? Really delve into that. And then how exactly can we counteract this risk for chronic inflammation in our bodies? So I'm going to share my screen really quickly because I've got some slides here that can be helpful. And actually, before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and find what I'm looking for. All right. I want to get a little bit of feedback from you, Christian, because this is supposed to be interactive, right? So, have you heard this idea of racism causing physical harm in Black bodies? Is this new to you or no?
That part wasn't new to me, I think, because racism causes me harm. So
Hmm.
I think what was
Can
new,
you abound? Can you expand on that? Expound on
I mean,
that?
I think we have a notion that white supremacy is contained to the daily lives of the stereotypical quote unquote Black impoverished person, when I think white supremacy and its superpower is to duplicate itself and to mutate. So it ekes into varying, like, so every strata of Black person's life. And so I think when it comes to, and I put myself in the young professional category, I think when it comes to Black professionals, there's just an overwhelming amount of very embedded and institutionalized racism against us in the workplace, as it were.
Yeah. So you're feeling some component of interpersonal racism, maybe in interactions that you have with folks. You mentioned institutional racism, and how repeatable are the effects of racism. And so that speaks to this systemic or structural nature of it, in which in some organizations, because of the makeup of the board or the leadership structure, it's going to be harder for Black Americans to rise to levels of power, to get promoted, to have their work acknowledged, etc.
Absolutely. And I think what was striking about what you said was that the inflammation is the root of so many different ailments. I mean, I know about the disparities in lifespans between Black folks and white folks in this country, but I didn't know that inflammation itself plays such a large role, which was scary.
Yeah, well, that's the purpose of all this, right? Is like we've been hit over the head, and this is Black History Month, so we're going to hear a lot about, we're going to hear the uplifting stories, but then we're also going to hear a lot about the disparities too. And I mean, we heard about that all this summer during the pandemic, during Black Lives Matter protests. We heard about these health disparities between Black Americans and their white counterparts, maternal mortality, COVID rates and death, etc. And I mean, I'm just tired of hearing about problems without very specific solutions. So that's what we're doing this month. We're coming up with some solutions, science-based solutions, so we can stop dying, stop suffering.
Right, that's right.
So inflammation is one of, there's a theory of social genomics that posits that inflammation is just one of these mechanisms through which social adversity, chronic social adversity, manifests in our bodies and causes harm. And here's where I'm going to share my screen. So this chronic social adversity is kind of a broad topic. It encompasses racism and other forms of social marginalization. So, homophobia, ableism, sexism, but it also, and classism. And then, it takes into account, in the body of literature that studies the effect of chronic social adversity on our health, it also takes into account the ways that long-term major social stressors, like raising a disabled child, can actually increase levels of inflammation in mother's blood, right? And lead to increased risk of disease above and beyond what you might expect from pure caregiver stress. So really fascinating to understand this mechanism. And it turns out that there is this really great paper that was published just in 2018, and there are quite a few of these, right? So I'm just highlighting one. And this one actually found, they were able to study structural racism and perceived discrimination. So they got the interpersonal racism piece covered. And they were able to follow 400 Black folks, a multi-center study, so all over the country, 400 Black folks from childhood to adulthood, about 20 years each, around 8 years of age to 28. And every few years, they would measure a few things. They'd survey these people on the level of perceived discrimination they reported. So that's the interpersonal racism component. They surveyed their environments for the level of residential segregation, like how much were their neighborhoods all Black? How segregated were their neighborhoods? Because we know that that's actually a manifestation of a structural racism. So they got that structural component. And then they measured the level of inflammatory markers in people's blood. And they took like 17 different measurements, 17 different markers were measured. And so they got this really broad swath. And over the course of time, what they were able to find, can you see my screen okay, by the way? It's blown up enough for you? Okay, good. And I'm just gonna shout out, this is by Simmons et al. In developmental psychology. But over the course of time, what they were able to find is a couple really fascinating things. First of all, experiencing structural and interpersonal racism in childhood predicted chronic inflammation with statistical significance. If you experienced racism as a kid, you had, beyond the chance of just random probability, a higher risk of having chronic inflammation as an adult when they saw you 20 years later. There was also this interaction, right? You're shaking your head. I know, it's crazy. There was this interaction between the effect that racism you experienced as an adult had on your inflammatory markers and whether or not you experienced racism or how much racism you experienced as a kid. So that's a little confusing. I'm going to put it differently. People who experienced more racism as kids had this snowball effect where as adults, they were more likely to have a very robust inflammatory response to incidents of racism or exposure to racism that occurred as adults. So there's kind of like a two-hit theory here, or a two-hit mechanism where as a kid, if you are exposed to racism, you've got increased risk of having chronic inflammation farther down the line. And then again, you are more likely to have your measures of inflammation, your markers of inflammation increase more robustly, even more every single time you are exposed to racism, even as an adult. So we already talked about the connection between chronic inflammation and these chronic diseases. I mentioned these inflammatory markers in the blood that Simmons et al. Measured. And so, if you were to Google inflammation or chronic inflammation, you'll see that these markers include CRP, IL-6, et cetera. And then we talked about this theory of social genomics, which suggests actually that, it's natural for your body to create inflammation in response to a threat. When we were, I'm just gonna pause right here. Any questions, Christian, or any thoughts on any of that stuff?
Why would your body respond to stress with inflammation?
Yeah, good question. So it's really counterintuitive, but this theory makes a lot of sense. And again, it's superimposed on this growing body of research that suggests, yeah, we do seem to respond to this chronic social adversity with inflammation. So what's the mechanism for that? And it's actually this evolutionarily conserved mechanism. So, all of us humans at one point had ancestors in Africa. And when we were, hunter-gatherers and we were out facing all sorts of danger, finding food, it was really important for our bodies to recognize threat. And when we recognize the threat, like an animal, some sort of leopard, right? Possible predator, two things happen. First, you set off this adrenergic fight or flight system. You know all about that, right? Fight or flight, hopefully you fly, right? But yeah, I would probably try to run. I don't know if I would fight the leopard, but look, that's the one component. Then there's this second system that gets set up. It says, you know what? If you undergo a physical threat, there's a chance that you will incur physical harm. And inflammation is really important for wound healing. It's important for helping you recover from physical harm. So your body, on one hand, prepares you to run or fight from this threat, and at the same time starts revving up your inflammatory system to make sure that your blood vessels are leaky and your tissues are leaky, and you're able to get the important cells and chemicals to the place of the wound, right? To the site of the wound, so that you can begin to heal the wound. Acute inflammation that lasts no more than 48 hours is a completely natural process of wound healing. It happens in our bodies all the time, right? Even with paper cuts, not a big deal. Problem comes in, right? In the fact that humans are exposed now to chronic threats. And so it turns out that our bodies see social threats, or our brains see social threats, in the same way that we saw physical threats back then. And back in the day, our ancestors were expected to see a leopard, see that physical threat, and then it would pass if they lived. And so the acute inflammation would resolve itself and they'd move on. Everything was fine. They weren't going to see the leopard every day, and they weren't going to see the leopard all day. What happens now is that folks living in systems of marginalization end up seeing this threat, feeling this threat all day, every day. Exactly. I see you nodding along. So that acute inflammation doesn't end up resolving. I mean, there's a mechanism in the body that's meant to be anti-inflammatory. It's meant to come back and sort of sweep up all the, close up the leaky vessels, sweep up all the tissue and cells and debris left over from inflammation, so that you can go on about your business. But when that social threat is ongoing, you never get that mechanism turned on. The other thing about having chronic inflammation in your body is, because it's meant in response to a threat, right? Temporally, it's meant to take precedence over, or have priority over most of your other bodily functions. So when you are managing inflammation, when you're ramping up inflammation, you're less able to manage your blood sugar, you're less able to manage your blood pressure. And really, it makes sense, because it's not, those functions are not so important in the 24 to 48 hours in which you're like fighting your way back from a leopard wound or something like that. So again, all great in the acute setting, but when you extend that interruption of bodily functions for years, for decades, that's one of the ways in which chronic inflammation, leads to increased risk of type 2 diabetes, leads to increased risk of obesity, leads to high blood pressure and then subsequently heart attack and stroke. So, you know, the studies that we've seen so far don't put people in situations in which they will necessarily have chronic social adversity. Like, that's kind of unethical at this point, right? So they're not randomized control trials. Which is the gold standard for proving causation. But we've got sort of the next best thing in this Simmons trial and a number of others, a prospective longitudinal trial in which we see a very strong correlation between this chronic between this chronic social adversity in the Simmons in the Simmons study, again, that chronic social adversity is racism. But we see that very strong correlation between chronic social adversity on one hand and then increased levels of chronic inflammation. And we see the relationship persist over time. And so we infer causation there. Any other thoughts?
I mean, correlation is always, good enough for me. But but I mean, I think if folks have been following along with Byte Wellness at home, I think that we would know then that diet also causes inflammation. So in marginalized groups are more likely to have a poorer diet, which causes inflammation in type 2 diabetes and heart attack and stroke. So now you're saying not only is the diet part a problem, just being Black and experiencing racial trauma in this country will also add to that risk of inflammation and poor health and chronic disease.
Yeah. Exactly. The problem compounds, right? And really what we'll get to is the reality that both structural and interpersonal racism cause various types of risks that negatively affects health. So I'm kind of struggling for the words to describe this, but let's just say, so there is this evolutionarily conserved mechanism we just described, right? Chronic social adversity, ongoing threat, racism that leads to chronic inflammation. You mentioned that there are all sorts of habits, just lifestyle habits like eating, exercise, even sleep, which can affect, either worsen or lower your risk for developing chronic inflammation. And it turns out that structural racism, right, in marginalizing Black American communities, structural racism concentrates the absence of resources, health resources, including nutritious food, access to providers, safe spaces outside to exercise, pollution-free air. The absence of all of these resources leads to behaviors in any rational human being that would increase your risk of chronic inflammation. So yeah, absolutely. There is a compounding risk here. And that's one of the reasons why we're focusing on this, right? Because this isn't something that I was taught in medical school. It's not something that we talk about enough in formal clinical settings. This idea that, hey, Black folks in the US have ridiculously high health risks. That risk is primarily called racism, right? There are a bunch of other things that we have to talk about, but when we talk about social determinants of health and we talk about disparities in access to resources, what we're talking about is structural racism. That's structural racism. And there's a component in which structural racism, by affecting our access to resources, affects behaviors, and there's a component in which structural racism and interpersonal racism have a direct effect on this evolutionarily conserved biological mechanism. And it all just piles on top. So this is what we're doing with Byte Wellness. Of course, we need to work just super duper hard to fight, to fight this increased risk. All right. So over the next few weeks of this month, of Black History Month, we're going to focus on the ways that our healthy habits, just everyday habits you don't have to stress too much about, can actually fight our increased risk of for chronic inflammation, right? So what are the anti-inflammatory eating habits, movement habits, and sleep habits? That's what we'll talk about for the next 3 weeks of February. But for today, we're going to talk about stress as a way of sort of approximating the chronic social adversity that we may face without realizing it. So really quickly, I'm going to ask you to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, on average, any given day this month, how stressed do you feel? How burdened do you feel? 1 to 10. What do you think?
On a daily basis?
Mm-hmm. If you had to average like all the days this month, what would you say?
How stressed was I on a scale? Maybe like a 7 or an 8.
So you're saying 7 to 8.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going with 5 to 6.
Okay.
And I'm going to reshare my screen.
Okay.
Because we're going to take the perceived stress scale.
Oh boy.
We're going to see how much this empiric representation of our stress matches up with, our observations, our perception.
Right.
So we're going to share here. And can you see that on the screen?
Yeah, I can.
Great. So there's this scale. We've got 10 questions. We've got 5 possible answers to each of these questions. Numbers from 0 to 4, spanning from never to almost never, sometimes fairly often, and very often. And you're going to use these numbers and these answers to answer each question. You don't have to share this with me if you don't want to, but it's a workshop. So, you're free to discuss it. I'll probably talk about my own just by way of example. So first question, in the last month, how often have you been upset because of something that happened unexpectedly? Never, almost never, sometimes, fairly often, very often.
Are you answering first or am I answering first?
I can answer first. I think I would say, I guess, I don't know. I guess I would say, see, here's what's tricky, right? I'm thinking 1, almost never, for things that have happened maybe in my own life. But even as I said that, I thought about like the Capitol riots.
Yeah.
And all these events that occur out in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I realized that, yeah, those actually do have quite an effect on me. So if I had to average, I'm gonna say sometimes. I'm gonna say 2.
I'm gonna say 3.
You're gonna say 3. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Just because of work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In the last month, how often have you felt that you were unable to control the important things in your life?
How about we just do 4 times 10?
But this is what I'm saying. This is like helpful. So I'm gonna go 1 with this. Like I have the privilege of running my own, company, and it's it's still a pretty small operation. And so I've got quite a bit of freedom about what happens in my everyday life. And so I feel like the things that are important to me, I have control over. I did not feel that way at all when I was in residency or, going through any of the rest of my training. So
That's right. That's right.
fluctuates.
Right. So
Case dependent.
So folks, if you're watching this, look at her and then look at me and see and notice those numbers. Notice those numbers, because I'm going to have to say a number. What if the numbers stop at 4? Let's make it
Yeah.
a 6. I give it a solid 6.
If 4 is very often, then 6 is like every daggone day. Is that what that is? Okay. All right. Let me give you a 4.
Is it too often? Too often.
Too much. It's too much.
It's too much. Much too much. Oh boy. Okay.
So, okay, third one. In the last month, how often have you felt nervous and stressed?
I guess 3.
I'm going to go with a 3 too. I'm somewhere between 2 and 3. Partly because, I get nervous every time I do these workshops. I still get as much as I speak publicly, I still get nervous before every single one. And I do this pretty often. So 3 is fairly often. That's probably more likely than 2, which is sometimes for me. What about you? You said 3.
Yeah, I said 3.
Okay.
Like, why? I felt nervous.
If you want to share.
I don't know if I would say nervous, but I guess stressed. I mean, if you catch yourself, fake yelling at someone who isn't there, I think that's pretty stressed.
That counts. That definitely counts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Or rage screaming into the void. I believe that's stressed. So I give myself a solid 3 there.
I think just recognizing the void, you at least get a 2 at minimum. Okay.
Screaming at people who are not there,
That too gets
that's
you.
A 3.
Yeah.
3.
Fourth question. We're almost halfway there. In the last month, how often have you felt confident about your ability to handle your personal problems?
Interesting. This is interesting. Well, so what's your number on this one?
I would say very often. I would go with 4. So in this case, like 4, the higher number is actually kind of better.
Yeah. That's important to be better.
No, because I had to catch myself for a second.
Think about it. Yeah.
And I'm gonna do this thing for the sake of our conversion later on. I'm gonna flip the scale. So 4 is actually 0.
Oh, okay.
And 0 is 4.
Okay, got it.
So what do you think yours would be? And I can expound on that. I mean, again, being my own boss helps. It helps a lot.
Yeah. I would say 4. I would still give myself a 3 fairly often.
Fairly often. You feel confident in doing these things fairly often. Confident in handling your own personal problems.
Yes.
Good. That's really good. So again, I'm gonna
do a Christian.
No. I wanted to be sure you didn't already flip the numbers. So now I'm gonna flip that 3 to 1.
We're still doing using this scale, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But I told you I'm flipping that item. Yeah.
Right. But I'm still answering.
You're answering using this scale, exactly. Okay. We got it cleared up. Number 5, in the last month, how often have you felt that things were going your way? Are
Interesting.
going your way?
Interesting. I don't know.
Uh-huh.
I guess I'm ambivalent about that one. Maybe I will give myself a 2.
Okay. I I'm like toggling between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
again, I feel a lot of agency right
Yes.
now in my
Yes.
business, but also starting up a business. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot that doesn't quite go my way. So I'm gonna go with fairly often 3, and then I'm
Okay.
converting that to 1. And
Okay.
you said 2, and so that
Mhm.
stays 2.
Okay.
Okay. We got 6. So in the last month, how often have you found that you could not cope with all the things you had to do?
The
Could
last.
not cope. Never, almost never, sometimes fairly often, very often.
Whew.
Um, I mean, like I'm actually gonna go with 4 here because this is a thing I'm working on personally, not overloading myself.
Yeah.
Stepping into that notion of, well, you are your own boss, so you don't have to stay up all night to do this thing. You can just decide to change the project. That takes work for
I'll go
me.
to
So,
bed. Yeah. Um, I want to answer honestly, but I don't know if this is a stress checklist or an intervention. Is my
tell
mother
the truth. Tell the
is
truth.
my mother with you? Like,
Actually, she's the one who put me up to it.
I think so this is an intervention. Um, I would say, but you know what though? I would just say I'll give myself a 2 because I was still
Okay.
bobbing and weaving.
Yeah. That's actually pretty good. That's good, Christian.
Yeah,
Bobbing and weaving. In
yeah.
the last month, how often, and I'm gonna just point out that bob and weave, classic coping strategies. Classic.
Fantastic.
In the last month, how often have you been able to control
Wow.
irritations in your life?
The irritants. How often have you been able to control
Yes.
irritants, Wooz? How often have you?
I think very often, again, this double-edged sword of I I can make this as good as I want it to be,
Yes, true.
but I put too much work on my plate.
Right.
So I'm gonna go with a 4. Very often, I'm able to control the irritations in my life.
I'm giving myself like another 2.
Okay.
Only sometimes.
So only sometimes. Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got my 4 switches to a 0, and your 2 stays a 2. We're just basically flipping the scale for all the measures where higher numbers actually mean less stress.
Mhm.
Okay. In the last month, how often have you felt that you were on top of things?
On top of what things?
Don't get blue.
No, no. Hey, that was
It's a
pretty good.
family setting.
No, not that. I just meant in like professional, like personal. You dirty bird.
I would say, okay, broadly, everywhere.
Oh, broadly.
Yeah.
I'm writing that one down. That was pretty good. But um, um, one.
One.
I don't know. I mean,
Almost never.
like on top, like one or two.
Yeah. I think I might go with a 1 here. Again, related to the putting too much work on my plate, just overloading the schedule. And then I get to like 9 p.m. and I still have so much work to do. And it's been like that every day for the last few months. But I'm gonna give that 1. You say 1 or 2. Which do you choose?
Oof. I give myself a 1.
Okay. All right. Don't feel pressured to be as
Oh no!
sorry as I am.
Oh no! Listen. I don't.
Okay. 9. In the last month, how often have you been angered because things, oh my God, I can't read. How often have you been angered because of things that were outside of your control?
Um, 4.
Very often.
Yeah.
Okay. Angered because of things that were outside of your control. I guess I'm gonna say almost never, because most of the stuff that bothers me I did to
Look at her.
myself.
Look at her,
So
folks. She's glowing. Look at her.
no, no, uh-uh, uh-uh.
Oh,
Mm. Last one. We made it. In the last
we
month,
made
how often have you felt difficulties were piling up so high that you could not overcome them?
it. Is yours a 4? Yours is a 4, isn't it? Based on
Yes,
the previous answers, I'm going to give you
very often, very often. Just
I
like,
think for this one, I would say a 2, only because of my ability to disassociate.
okay,
Yeah.
cool,
Yeah.
cool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're gonna add up our answers. You weren't keeping track, were you, of yours?
No,
I
I
was.
wasn't.
Okay, no worries.
Okay.
We're gonna add this up. We've
Thank God
got
you did. Oh,
um okay.
whose is this one?
Whose is what one?
This score you have to read.
What?
Wait, aren't you adding the scores up?
Oh yeah.
So which score is this you about to read? Which score is this? Whose is this?
Oh, this is yours.
Oh.
Um,
Convert them. You can convert them so it's a low number now, right?
8. Well, here's the thing, right? Exactly. So we're gonna take the total score, add it all up, and then gonna divide by 4.
Okay.
So do you want to hear your score?
Sure.
Just making the whole thing public, but it's all good.
Sure.
So I do need a calculator for this, but I can tell you.
So it's saying it's really high. So listen.
No, it's just not an even number because I have to divide it
Oh,
by 4. But
okay.
I'll
So we don't have
say
to. I
that
don't hide anything from the audience. We don't hide anything from the audience.
right. So you added up to a 23
Oh goodness.
out of 40.
Oh, that's not.
Yeah. So I mean, I can tell you this without a calculator that you undershot your expected score. You said 7 to 8 out of 10,
Mm-hmm.
sort of how stressed you felt.
Mm-hmm.
And um, this is like 5 to 6. It's 5 and change, or
Right.
just under
Oh,
6
got it.
is what dividing it by 4 gets you. And then I'm gonna add up mine here.
Okay. Yours
Um,
was you had smaller numbers, which accounts for the skin.
I did, but not that much small. What did you say?
Which accounts for the skin. Come on.
I give it all to my ring light. The ring.
Oh boy.
All right. Well, I'm at 4 and change. So you were kind of between 5 and 6.
Yeah.
17 was my total. And
Okay.
so we're dividing that by 4, and I'm at just like 4, and I guess it's what, a quarter, and you're
Yeah.
at 5 and 7/5 out of 10. So, we were both lower than we expected to be.
Yeah. You were.
Which makes me feel a little bit better.
Oh, good, good. It makes me not trust myself. I'm an unreliable narrator.
Well, you know what though?
What?
Like maybe there's something to be said for just the feeling of being overwhelmed, right? And
Mm,
maybe that's what we were testing for when we um, had those initial projections.
right.
And
Right.
so maybe when we broke down stress into
Mm-hmm.
a scale of multiple components,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for you and I, both of our highest scores had to do with being just horribly overwhelmed. Like,
Almost incapacitated by.
yeah. And so
Yes.
it makes sense that maybe we would overcall just how stressed we are because it's so awful.
Oh,
But
sad.
it makes me feel better, I guess, to know that according to this scale,
Yeah.
and we like rejiggered it a little bit,
Right. Right.
but according to this scale, I'm doing a little better than I thought.
Right. Right. Right.
Mhm.
Right. Right. And I haven't been committed to an asylum yet.
What I think would be amazing though is, if we could get even lower. I mean, we were both sort of circling that middle,
Mm,
right around 4 and 5 out of 10.
mhm,
And
mhm.
wouldn't it be great to be kind of in that lower third, 3 and
Yeah.
under?
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things that we'll keep in mind as we go through the next few weeks of anti-inflammatory eating, anti-inflammatory movement, anti-inflammatory rest. Just sort of keep in mind that like our stress scores weren't through the roof,
No.
but they also weren't perfect. I'm not like on an island somewhere right now on vacation.
Right.
So we
I mean, come on, as if.
we have to that face. That side eye said it all. But I mean that means that we have to be just cognizant of our healthy habits, our daily habits, and do as much as we can to counteract the stress that we obviously feel on a regular basis, that, you know, chronic adversity that leads to
Right.
chronic inflammation. So, all right, thank you so much for tuning in. We've got another one on Saturday, but you have already gotten your workshop in, so you don't need to come to this one. Thank you so much.
So much
And
fun.
we'll be back next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern and Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern. Have a good one.
Bye.
Bye.